They say a man's life is a series of bets. Small ones, like whether the coffee will stay hot on the drive to work, or bigger ones, like who you marry, where you live, what job you take. But every now and then, there comes a gamble so immense it swallows all the others. A single roll of the dice where everything you've ever built, everything you hope to be, sits on the table. In that moment, the world shrinks to just you and that decision, alone, with the echoes of every past regret and every future dream screaming in your ears. It's a moment of desperate hope, a belief that this one time, this one shot, will be the one to change everything. And sometimes you lose it all. Lester was a man who knew a thing or two about those kinds of bets. 45 years old, most of those years spent under the relentless, indifferent hum of the factory floor. The kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of oil and metal dust, and the loudest sound was the collective groan of machinery, a symphony of tireless industry that never truly stopped. He wasn't a talker, not by a long shot. More of a nod-and-get-to-it kind of man, his words sparse but weighted, like the heavy tools he handled with such practiced ease. His face was a roadmap of hard miles, lines etched around eyes that had seen too many sunrises from the wrong side of the alarm clock. There was a quiet gruffness about him, an unspoken rule that you left him to his work, and he'd do the same for you. His shoulders, though still broad from years of hauling and lifting, carried a slump that spoke of burdens heavier than any crate. Every morning, when he caught his reflection in the steamed-up bathroom mirror, he saw a man built for resilience, for endurance. But he also saw the cumulative weight of 45 years settling in, pressing down on the corners of his mouth, dimming the light in his eyes just a fraction. His hands, though, those were the real storytellers, calloused, scarred, the knuckles thick and gnarled from 1,000 tight wrenches and heavy pushes. They were the hands of a man who built, who fixed, who endured. They knew the bite of cold steel in winter and the slick grime of hydraulic fluid in summer. These hands had provided, had toiled without complaint, had clutched his children's tiny fingers and held his wife close in moments of quiet joy. They were honest hands, workers' hands, but also hands that had, not so long ago, reached out for something more, something beyond the predictable rhythm of the assembly line. And in the depths of his tired eyes, behind the steady gaze, you could still catch a flicker, a stubborn little spark that refused to be extinguished, even after the biggest bet of his life had turned to dust. That stubborn little spark, it was what dragged Lester out of bed every morning at 5. Not with a jolt, but with a weary, practiced groan as the digital numbers on the alarm clock glowed an accusatory red. 5 o'clock already. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, faintly clinging to his work clothes from yesterday, was the first thing that greeted him, even before the real coffee started brewing. He moved through the pre-dawn quiet of his small house like a ghost, careful not to wake Sarah or the kids. Lily, 14, with her endless homework and dreams of college, and Ethan, 11, who still woke up sometimes thinking there was a monster under his bed. They were the reason for the alarm, for the grind, for every tired muscle and aching joint. A quick shower, the water barely warm enough, a shave that left a tiny nick on his jawline most mornings, and then downstairs. A mug of black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, standing by the kitchen window, watching the streetlights flick off one by one like promises being broken. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns, the same potholes he knew by heart, the same silent parade of other working men in their own beat-up trucks and sedans, all heading to their own posts in the industrial arteries of the city. He saw the same faces in the parking lot, nodded a gruff greeting or two, and then the doors would clang shut behind him, sealing him into the world of steel and noise and the relentless thrum of machinery. His section was the assembly line for heavy-duty tractor components. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, it was the same sequence. Lift the housing, align the bearings, tighten the bolts, weld the seam, push it down the line. The rhythmic clank and whir, the hiss of pneumatics, the sharp tang of metal and oil, it was the soundtrack to his life. His body had memorized the movements. His hands had developed a muscle memory that performed the tasks almost without conscious thought, leaving his mind free to wander, or more often to worry. The paychecks, though steady, were always just enough to keep the wolves from the door, never enough to chase them away for good. Every month was a delicate balancing act. The mortgage on the older, well-maintained house, a little cluttered with family life, but a sanctuary nonetheless. The rising cost of groceries, Lily's school supplies, Ethan's worn-out sneakers, The unexpected car repair that always seemed to pop up right when they finally had a little extra. Lester would sit at the kitchen table late at night, a single bulb casting a harsh light on the stacks of bills, Sarah's quiet breathing from the bedroom the only sound, and he'd push numbers around, try to stretch every dollar like a rubber band on its last snap. It was a constant fight, and he was tired of just holding the line. Buried deep beneath the grime of the factory floor and the weight of those bills was a constant, gnawing hunger, a burning desire for more. Not for riches, not really, but for freedom. Freedom from the alarm clock, from the constant hum of the assembly line, from the quiet terror that one unexpected illness or job layoff could send everything he'd built tumbling down. He wanted to provide a cushion, a real safety net for Sarah and the kids, something truly secure. He wanted Lily to go to any college she wanted, not just the one they could afford. He wanted Ethan to chase whatever wild dream captured his imagination without the crushing reality of financial constraints. And that was where the demons lived, right alongside the dreams. The echo of past failure, a bitter taste that lingered on his tongue. That big bet, the all-in gamble on the local business venture. Every penny, every borrowed dime. He'd seen it as his escape hatch, his one shot to break free, driven by a stubborn pride that told him his sheer effort, his belief was enough. He'd invested himself, body and soul, convincing himself that hard work alone would guarantee success. It was the arrogance of a man who'd always relied on his own two hands, who believed in the simple equation, effort equals reward. But the world, he'd learned the hard way, didn't always work on simple equations. The memory of the collapse, the sickening lurch in his gut, the shame that had coiled itself around his heart, it was never far away. It whispered to him during the monotonous hours at the factory, taunted him when he looked at the worried lines on Sarah's face, and screamed at him in the dead of night. He had almost lost everything, the house, their stability, the trust he saw in his children's eyes. The fear of repeating that mistake, of not being enough, of failing his family again, was a heavy cloak he wore constantly, even when he forced a smile for Lily and Ethan. He bottled it all up, his pride a wall against asking for help, his ingrained belief in self-reliance a double-edged sword. He was Lester, the man who worked hard, the man who provided, and admitting defeat or even just struggle felt like tearing down the very foundations of who he was. Yet beneath it all, that stubborn spark still flickered, a quiet rebellion against a life defined solely by what he'd lost. The day it all crumbled wasn't dramatic in the way he'd imagined failure would be. No shouting, no dramatic walkouts. It was quiet, insidious, like rot spreading through a beam until the whole house gives a sigh and drops. Lester remembered the email. Subject line, important update regarding your investment. But the tone was already dead on arrival. He was on his lunch break, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee in the break room, the din of the factory a dull throb beyond the thin walls. He clicked it open, his thumb shaking barely perceptible. The words swam before his eyes: unforeseen market conditions, operational inefficiencies, dissolution of assets. Corporate speak for your broke, buddy. The break room, normally a haven of mundane chatter, suddenly felt too loud, too bright. A coworker laughed at a joke he didn't hear. The coffee tasted like ash. He scrolled down, searching for a lifeline, a glimmer of hope. There was none. Every penny, every last dime. The savings account, the equity he'd leveraged from their small house, the kids' college fund, all of it swallowed whole by the ambitious venture that had promised so much. He felt it physically, like a punch to the gut, the air sucked clean out of his lungs. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, crushing weight of it all. He wasn't just back where he started, he was worse off. Far worse. He had promised Sarah a future, had looked Lily and Ethan in the eyes and pictured them free from the grind he knew, and now he had almost taken their home. His chest constricted, a vice grip around his heart. The stubborn spark, the quiet rebellion, it wasn't just flickering now. It felt like it had been doused, leaving only cold, dead embers. He folded the cheap paper napkin slowly, meticulously, trying to regain some semblance of control over his shaking hands, over the tremor that threatened to split him open. The silence within him was deafening. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. Lester lay awake, staring at the muted glow of the digital clock on the bedside table. 3:17 a.m. Then 3:18. Sarah was a warm weight beside him, her breathing soft and even. Lily and Ethan were just down the hall, oblivious in their dreams. And he, their protector, their provider, had gambled it all away. He eased himself out of bed, the floorboards groaning a protest under his weight, and padded silently into the living room. The streetlights cast long, ghostly shadows through the blinds. He sank onto the worn armchair, the one Sarah always said needed replacing. His head fell into his hands, the rough texture of his palms a stark reminder of the work he did, the work he was now tied to more firmly than ever. The brutal honesty of the pre-dawn hours stripped away all pretense, all pride. He saw himself for what he was. A fool, a proud, arrogant fool who thought sheer will could bend reality to his desires. What had he become? A man burdened by a secret shame, haunted by the specter of impending financial ruin, terrified to look his family in the eye and admit the depth of his mistake. He had yearned for freedom, for a better life for them, and in chasing it, he had almost chained them to a debt they didn't ask for. The memory of Sarah's trusting smile, of Lily's excited chatter about art school, of Ethan's quiet dreams of building things, it all twisted in his gut. He was supposed to build, not dismantle. He was supposed to secure, not jeopardize. The factory job, once merely tolerable, now felt like a cage he had built for himself. The anger, hot and sharp, wasn't for the failed venture or the economy or anyone else. It was for Lester, the man who had risked everything without truly understanding the odds or the cost of losing. He had lost not just money, but a piece of himself, and worse, he had almost lost their future. He sat there, shivering slightly in the cool, silent house, feeling utterly hollowed out, utterly lost. The stubborn spark was gone, replaced by a cold, suffocating despair. The first faint hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, seeping through the gaps in the blinds, painting the edges of the living room in dull, unforgiving tones. Lester still sat there, rigid, the same chill gnawing at his bones, deep within his marrow. He hadn't moved for hours, paralyzed by the weight of his own disastrous choices. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, a constant, indifferent presence that mocked his internal turmoil. He traced the grain of the worn wood table with a trembling finger, each ridge and valley a physical representation of the rough road he had traveled, and the even rougher one stretching ahead. He had made a mess, a colossal, unforgivable mess, and he had no idea how to clean it up. But as the world outside began to stir, as the first birds chirped tentative notes, a different kind of quiet settled over him. Not the quiet of despair that had consumed him, but the quiet of something breaking inside, something that had held him paralyzed for too long. He was tired. Not just physically, though his body screamed for rest, but bone-deep, soul-weary tired of the relentless weight of it all. Tired of the shame, tired of the fear, tired of the suffocating paralysis that had gripped him since the news had landed like a death knell. He couldn't fix it right now. He didn't have the answers. But he knew with a certainty that sliced through the fog that he couldn't just sit here and dissolve into nothing. He heard Sarah rustle in their bedroom, a soft sigh of a woman preparing for another day. Lily's alarm would go off in an hour. Ethan would soon be calling for breakfast. Life, relentless and unyielding, was coming for them, and for him, a single guttural sound escaped his throat, barely a whisper, yet it felt monumental, like a mountain shifting. Enough! It wasn't a roar of defiance, not yet. It was a dying man's last breath, a resignation that paradoxically held the seed of something else, something stubborn and unyielding. Enough of the self-pity. Enough of the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. Enough of letting this thing, this massive, public failure, consume every shred of who he was. He still didn't know how he would face his family, or his bank statement, or the crushing weight of public perception that felt like a physical burden. But he knew this much. He couldn't stay here in this broken heap. He had to move, even if it was just one agonizing foot in front of the other. The ground had fallen out from under him, but he found, to his surprise, that he still had feet. And a body that, however weary, however battered, could still be forced to stand. The clock radio blinked 5:00 a.m. It was Monday. He hadn't slept, not truly, not since the news broke. He pushed himself up from the table, his muscles protesting, stiff and cold, his joints aching as if he'd been run over by one of the forklifts at work. The familiar routine, usually a mindless drone he could perform half asleep, now felt like an impossible summit to scale. Shower. Coffee, lunchbox. Each step, each simple movement was an act of brutal, exhausting will, a battle against the gravitational pull of despair. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was a stranger, hollow eyes, bloodshot and ringed with dark circles, gaunt cheeks, a new landscape of lines etched around his mouth that seemed to deepen with the weight he carried. He looked at the man staring back and saw a shell, a beaten dog, a coward, a failure. But somewhere, buried beneath the wreckage of his dreams, beneath the shame and the financial disaster, was a stubbornness he hadn't known could survive such a hit. It refused to fully capitulate. He pulled on his work boots, the leather cracked and worn, the laces thick and frayed, 100,000 steps embedded in their weave. Each tug of the laces was a silent argument with himself, a battle against the overwhelming urge to just stay home, pull the covers over his head, and disappear from the world, from his family, from his own terrible mistakes. What was the point? He'd gambled everything, lost it all, and now he was back to punching the clock with less than he had started, worse off than he'd been a decade ago. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth, a flavor of ash and regret. He walked out the door before anyone else was awake, the cold morning air a physical slap to his face, rattling his teeth. The factory loomed in the distance, a massive, unyielding beast of steel and concrete, its smoke stacks already breathing thick plumes into the pre-dawn sky, a monstrous testament to relentless, unending labor. He usually found a certain grim satisfaction in the regularity of it, the honest labor, the predictable rhythm of production. Today it felt like a prison sentence, a life sentence he had unknowingly passed upon himself. His shift started. The roar of the machinery, usually just background noise that faded into the hum of his own thoughts, now grated on his nerves like sandpaper across raw skin. The acrid smell of oil and metal, the deafening clank and hiss of the presses, the relentless, hypnotic rhythm of the conveyor belts, it all assaulted his senses, amplifying his headache, turning his stomach. He moved through the motions, loading heavy sheets of steel, pushing levers, stamping parts, his body a well-oiled machine on autopilot, while his mind wrestled endlessly with the specter of his colossal mistake. Every piece of steel he hefted felt heavier than the last, every repetitive movement a mocking echo of the grand dreams he'd harbored for his family's escape. Morning, Lester. Bill from the next station over, a man Lester had worked with for 15 years, offered a quiet nod, his eyes holding a question Lester didn't want to answer. Lester just grunted in response, not trusting his voice, afraid it would crack, afraid he would say something he'd regret, or worse, break down entirely. He knew Bill and everyone else on the floor had heard the whispers, seen the local paper's small, damning article about the failed venture. He felt their eyes, even when they weren't looking directly at him, felt the weight of their unspoken pity, or worse, their quiet, knowing judgment. His pride, already shattered into 1,000 pieces, felt raw and exposed, like an open wound festering in the harsh fluorescent light. He thought of turning around, walking out, just letting the whole thing crumble, letting the factory swallow him whole or spit him out. He had lost everything else. What was one more thing? What was the point of enduring this public humiliation, this personal agony for a paltry hourly wage? But then he pictured Sarah's face, tired but resilient, her quiet strength a bulwark against the storm. He heard Lily's excited chatter about art school, Ethan's quiet dreams of building things with his own 2 hands. He hadn't lost them. Not yet. And this job, this miserable, soul-numbing job, was the only thing keeping a roof over their heads now, the only barrier between them and true destitution. It was the only way he could even begin to pay back the second mortgage, the loans, the wreckage he'd created. It wasn't about the money, not entirely. It was about showing up. It was about proving, if only to himself, that he wasn't broken beyond repair, that there was still some fundamental, unbreakable core inside him. That even after betting everything and losing it all in the most spectacular, self-destructive way imaginable, he still had the sheer, mulish, stubborn will to get out of bed, to put one foot in front of the other, to face the music, however discordant and painful it sounded. He was bleeding, certainly, but he wasn't dead. And a dead man couldn't learn. A dead man couldn't try again. He leaned into the next load, the heavy steel biting into his shoulder, a physical ache to match the one in his chest, a dull, throbbing pain that served as a constant reminder of his failure, but also of his continued existence. The first step on the long, arduous road back was simply showing up. He didn't know what he was going to do or how he would ever fix this mess, but he knew he wasn't going to quit everything. Not yet. This was the raw, guttural truth of survival, the first fundamental rule of anyone who ever came back from the brink. You don't quit just because the world knocked you on your ass. You might not know the next move, but you damn well keep breathing. You keep moving. Day 3 for Lester felt less like a day and more like an eternity stretched thin over a rusty rack. Every lift, every clang of steel, every whine of machinery was a fresh cut. His shoulders burned, not just from the physical strain, he was used to that, but from the invisible weight of his thoughts. The silence between the shifts, the ride home, the quiet dinners where Sarah carefully avoided looking at him too long, those were the real battlegrounds. He'd catch himself staring at his plate, the food tasting like ash, his mind replaying the moment the lawyer's voice had turned cold, flat, confirming the worst. He'd want to scream, to lash out, to just crumple into a heap and not move for a week. The urge to call in sick, to just pull the covers over his head and disappear, was a physical pang in his gut. What was the point? He'd gambled, he'd lost. He was back where he started, only poorer, deeper in the hole with the added burden of shame. His pride, which had fueled his reckless ambition, now gnawed at him, twisting into a bitter resentment for his own foolishness. He deserved this, he told himself, but his family didn't. That was the hook, the barb that kept him from giving in. Lily's soft goodnight kiss, Ethan's excited chatter about a school project. Those tiny, mundane moments were the anchors in the storm of his self-loathing. He'd clench his jaw, feel the tremor in his hands, and force himself to finish whatever he was doing, to simply endure until the next task, the next hour, the next shift. By day 7, the physical exhaustion was a dull roar, but it was the mental exhaustion that truly wore him down. The constant hum of regret, the what-ifs, the self-recrimination. It was a heavier load than any steel beam. He started making small mistakes at work, misplacing a tool, momentarily forgetting a sequence in the assembly line. Nothing major, nothing that got him yelled at, but enough to draw a sharp glance from a foreman, enough to confirm his own gnawing fear that he was losing his edge, losing his mind. He'd stand there, hands on his hips, watching the conveyor belt carry away another finished product, and his mind would drift. He'd see the empty storefront, the for lease sign. He'd hear the polite but firm tone of the bank manager. He'd feel the cold knot of fear in his stomach, the same fear that had pushed him to take that impossible gamble in the first place. He wanted to throw his safety helmet against the wall, to just walk out and never look back. But then he'd picture Sarah, her tired but steady eyes, the way she'd squeeze his hand sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, a silent message of support and worry all at once. He couldn't add, walked out on his job, to the ledger of his failures. He couldn't. So he'd shake his head, rub his tired eyes, and pick up the next piece, forcing his focus back to the immediate tangible task, one small, insignificant victory over the swirling chaos within. Day 14 arrived with a brutal cold snap, and Lester felt it in his bones. The factory floor was colder than usual, the concrete sucking the warmth from his feet. He felt a cough rattling in his chest, a dull ache in his knees. He was tired, so profoundly tired that even breathing felt like effort. That morning, Ethan had asked why they couldn't get the new video game console like his friend Mark. Lily had mentioned a school trip she might have to miss. Lester had mumbled something about money being tight, the familiar sting of inadequacy twisting inside him. He'd snapped at Sarah when she asked if he was okay, regretting it immediately, the words feeling like shards of glass in his own mouth. He just wanted to be left alone, to disappear into the noise and sweat of the factory, to numb himself to the constant thrum of his own inadequacy. During his break, he sat alone in the corner of the locker room, hunched over his cold coffee, listening to the easy banter of the other men. He felt like an alien, a phantom among the living. He saw a notice on the bulletin board for overtime shifts. His first instinct was to ignore it, to simply go home and collapse. But then he remembered the video game console, the school trip. He remembered the quiet fear in Sarah's eyes. He stood up slowly, his muscles protesting, and walked over to the board, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He wasn't doing this for glory or for some grand redemption. He was doing it because he was still here, still breathing, still needed. He signed his name, the pen feeling heavy in his shaking hand, and walked back to the floor, ready for another 8 hours, then another 4. He wouldn't quit. He couldn't. Not while his name was still Lester and he had a family counting on him. It wasn't about winning. It was about not losing everything, not yet. It was about the stubborn, bloody refusal to lie down and die. The extra shifts blurred into weeks, then months. Lester became a ghost in his own house, leaving before dawn, returning long after dinner, the smell of grease and metal clinging to his clothes. He was tired beyond tired, a bone-deep weariness that settled in his joints, etched itself around his eyes. But somewhere in that relentless grind, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden light bulb moment, not an epiphany under the fluorescent hum of the factory floor. It was slower, like the way water grinds down rock, imperceptible day by day, until one morning you look and the landscape is subtly changed. The brutal repetition, the sheer physical exhaustion, paradoxically began to clear his head. Without the frantic, desperate energy of chasing a quick fix, without the gnawing anxiety of the grand gamble, his mind found a different rhythm. He was still quiet, still kept to himself, but instead of the vacant stare of a man defeated, there was a new kind of focus. He started seeing things on the assembly line, not just doing them. He noticed the minute hesitations in the machine, the subtle inefficiencies in how parts were moved, the small bottlenecks that cost seconds, then minutes, then hours over a full shift. He wasn't looking for a way out anymore, he was just looking. One Tuesday, a new batch of raw material came in, slightly off-spec, causing the hydraulic press to jam more frequently. Everyone griped. Lester, instead of just grumbling with the rest, found himself thinking, analyzing the angle, the pressure. He remembered a trick he'd seen an old-timer use years ago, a minor adjustment to the feed arm that eased the strain. He quietly made the suggestion to his foreman, a grizzled old-timer named Frank who usually dismissed new ideas with a grunt. Frank watched Lester demonstrate, his brow furrowed, then nodded slowly. It worked. The line ran smoother that day. Lester didn't boast, didn't even seem to notice the shift in Frank's regard. He just kept working. Sarah noticed it first at home. He was still exhausted, but the tension had bled out of his shoulders. He no longer snapped. One evening after the kids were in bed, he sat at the kitchen table, not with a beer and a blank stare, but with a worn notebook. He wasn't sketching out some grand business plan. He was drawing diagrams of the factory floor, annotating them with flow charts, scribbling notes about material delivery and waste reduction. "What's all that, honey?" Sarah asked gently, placing a cup of tea in front of him. He looked up, a faint, almost shy smile touching his lips. "Just trying to figure out if there's a better way to do things on the line. Small stuff, nothing much." But it was much, it was everything. It was the spark that had been buried under fear and failure, reignited not by ambition for a quick fortune, but by the quiet satisfaction of problem solving. He was no longer internalizing his problems. He was dissecting them. He was treating the factory line with the same analytical scrutiny he should have applied to his grand business venture. He wasn't just working harder, he was working smarter, and he was learning to share the process, to talk through his thoughts, to listen. Weeks later, the lean muscle in his arms had defined further, his grip on his tools firmer. His face, though still bearing the marks of hard work, held a different kind of light in his eyes. He still woke before the sun, still pulled long shifts, but the factory no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a classroom, a laboratory, a proving ground. He wasn't just a cog. He was a mind engaged, a man finding purpose not in escape, but in mastery of his present. One Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with Lily and Ethan, Lily was struggling with a complex math problem for school. Instead of the usual exasperated, "Just read the book." Lester pulled up a chair. He didn't just give her the answer. He broke the problem down step by step, showing her how each part connected, how to identify the variables, how to analyze the information before jumping to a conclusion. He used analogies from the factory floor, making her laugh. As she finally grasped it, a triumphant grin on her face, Lester leaned back, a quiet satisfaction in his own eyes. "See, Lilybug?" he said, his voice softer, wiser now. "It ain't about winning every hand right out the gate. It's about knowing when to fold, yeah, but more important, it's about figuring out why you had to fold. What went wrong? What you missed? And then having the guts to sit back down at the table, a little smarter this time, with a better plan. You don't quit just because you got burned once. You learn the fire." He understood now. Winners didn't risk it all again because they were reckless. They risked it again because they weren't the same person who lost the first time. They depaid for a lesson, a hard one, and they weren't about to let that tuition go to waste. Lester wasn't aiming for another all-in bet. He was aiming for smarter bets, calculated risks, built on observation, analysis, and the quiet, stubborn confidence that comes from knowing you can fall, learn, and get back up. He was still a factory man, but he was also a man who had stared into the abyss of his own failure and found not just a way back, but a better path forward. There are men out there, men like Lester, who learn the hard way that life isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about remembering how to stand,